Welcome back to our panel discussion, Cybersecurity in today's DoD, sponsored by Leidos, here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. My guests are Mitchell Komaroff, Principal Advisor for Cybersecurity Strategy in Planning and Oversight in the Department of Defense Chief Information Officer's Office. Keith Johnson is the Chief Technology Officer and Chief Engineer for the Defense and Intelligence Group at Leidos. And Servio Medina is Chief of the Cybersecurity Policy Branch at the Defense Health Agency. And Keith, before the break, we were discussing the idea of getting enough data analytics to be able to profile attacks, which then gives you a clue to who is attacking or what group they might be coming from. And I want to pull on that a little bit because it seems like that could help get to attribution, which is sometimes useful in this cyber deal. How does that work?
Well, attribution has kind of many layers. Ultimately, if you're looking for belly buttons, it's a difficult activity, but it's something that we do support, and we're proud of our history of contributing to the Defense Department. Campaigns and threat actors, named threat actors that then other parties and agencies can then use and start with a body of knowledge and then look for those same signatures, because cyber in some ways it's not a one-man sport, right? We want to share and collaborate to look for those. Basically, the work that I do is not just for me. I can use that data to protect other people as well. So there's definitely information we want to share. That is an area.
Profile is one thing, and you can recognize the profile, but that doesn't mean you know where they're coming from.
Ultimately, it's very difficult to get down to a belly button and name with just cyber data. That's where you look to other data sources to help vector to particular parties. Again, it's not just about bits and bytes, right? It's about you're looking for people and intent. The intent comes with the ways they're doing things. The TTPs is what we call them, the techniques and plans that the adversary uses. But the people aspect usually requires additional data sources that kind of help you vector in on those people.
Yeah, and Mitchell, I mean, DoD has a little more latitude than civilian agencies in maybe turning around an attack, but you don't do that very often. And I think it's done with great caution because of how hard it is to pin down where it's precisely coming from.
That's correct. So this issue of attribution and the distinction of making that ultimate call about who's responsible is that kind of transition point from going from shield to sword. But the key point is that this notion of TTPs being actually the way that a particular attack may unfold is important from a predictive perspective. That is, if we integrate into our predictive analytics a model that includes all the TTPs that we know about, and ultimately we're observing early steps in the attack lifecycle, we can soon pretty quickly triangulate. If we see basically certain early steps taking place, and then within our situational awareness infrastructure we see other steps light up that can be tied to those TTPs and will allow us to predict where future steps might occur, and therefore essentially allow us to head them off at the pass from a defensive.
And TTPs again stands for?
Techniques, tactics, and procedures.
Tactics, and procedures.
Right, so it's ultimately the attack life cycle. I'm, as an adversary, looking to basically accomplish the particular objectives of, essentially gaining a foothold, moving laterally, being able to gather, say, the information that I need, being able to remove it, being able to clean up after myself. There are different ways of doing that, and doing each of those individual steps, and which ones are selected can become the hallmark of a TTP that we can use, potentially to attribute, but ultimately not necessarily to attribute, but clearly to predict future steps in that
at least
TTP.
To protect against.
That's correct.
Right. It's almost like you can look at the score marks on a piece of ordnance and tell what type of technique was used to launch it, even though if you don't know who did it.
That's correct.
there's humans behind, and so humans have behaviors, right? And behaviors are kind of unique to culture and to group mentalities, and even done to the person. And so ultimately, what you're doing is you're looking for those behaviors that are instantiated in TTPs that you can then go look for.
Sure. In Servio, do you have profilers in some of that human capital side of things that can look at these and say, yeah, this is somebody in a basement in XYZ part of the world?
Yes, but I'd almost like to turn the lens around, if you will. I know the profile is looking at attribution from where the attack source is coming from, but turning it inward to an organization, how are we profiling the organization's posture and maturity from policy? Let me start with people, products, policy, and processes. Personally, I'm excited at the idea of predictive analytics. I've not been involved, but I can't tell you how many times I get the question, oh, so you studied graduate studies in mathematics. Do you ever use it? And I say, well, yes, of course. I have a logical approach to things, a rigor of study, a rigor of thought. But here's an opportunity for regression analysis and modeling. Though I wouldn't be involved in doing it, I would be absolutely jazzed to study it. I would pause and only hope also that we would be as excited to improve the products and processes we have in place today. And I'll give you a quick example. Our colleagues in the DHA Privacy and Civil Liberties Office hold an incident response tabletop exercise annually, mock scenarios. Actual DHA headquarter officials were involved. During one of the outbriefs, the scenario unfolded where there was 10,000 records that went missing and a breach was reported. Again, a scenario. And it involved a doctor using authorized access. So here's kind of a touchy situation. Is this inappropriate or not? They're using authorized credentials, authorized system. During the outbrief, one of the inner circle officials who was receiving the brief, not an IT guy, not a cybersecurity guy, used to be a practicing psychiatrist, speaking of the behavior. And he asked a poignant question that stopped the room. Can the IT we have in place today be configured to detect anomalous behavior? So I'm really excited at what predictive analytics can mean for us going forward. But first, I would love for us to see how are we really optimizing the use of what we have in place today. And it was because of his question that it led to further dialogue that might not have. Sometimes it takes an incident. That's the silver lining in an incident, even if it's a mock scenario, to get a dialogue going of what do we have in place once we become more mature and leveraging all of our tools in our arsenal, then how can we further enhance by additional IT capabilities, predictive analytics, data loss prevention, et cetera. So kind of turning it inwards a little bit.
And that gets us to the idea of the insider threat, which is a big deal for every federal agency, including DoD. And what's the latest thinking in dealing with insider threats? Because they occur, they act.
Yes, so within the department, we're implementing an insider threat program, and our Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence has the lead for the overall program. Ultimately, insider threat, there's no silver bullet, and really drives a requirement for a real interdisciplinary approach. I think that both Servio and Keith mentioned key ideas here. One is that we really do need to leverage the information technology capabilities that we have to look for anomalous behaviors within our networking infrastructure. But in addition, we actually need to be able to leverage information that's off-net that also is indicative of anomalous behavior. And we need to be able to integrate those two stovepipes and apply our analytics to that, and actually also the expert people that can evaluate the data need to be able to look at that same data together. So
for example, an IP address or a person, which if it's inside, who's assigned to that machine, downloaded these files, that same person externally, you find out, went to a foreign country the next day. I'm making up that example, but that kind of thing, is that what you mean?
Yes. So it's ultimately, there are transactions, people's behavior leaves a trace within the networking infrastructure that situational awareness is trying to ferret out. But they also leave a trace in transactions that occur off-net, and ultimately we need to be able to cross-correlate.
So for industry, so we at Leidos, we've implemented a very robust insider threat program in response to the potential loss of data, both ours and our customers. And as Mitchell mentioned, it is not just about cyber data. Cyber data is a part of it, but we are looking at all kinds of data that could help us understand where the risks are. And so risks are, and have we defined them, they are about the behaviors. They're also about who is accessing what kinds of data. So we've categorized the data and who has access to it. And so even if your behavior may not be very anomalous, just by the fact that you have access to certain data sources elevates your risk. And so we have a continuous evaluation program at Leidos where we're every day we're looking at individuals and our assessed risk of their risk profile based on their access patterns and other behaviors. And then we leverage that big data analytic capability in order to vector our analysts to go do some additional investigations. Sometimes it's anomalous. Sometimes it's really not a insider threat. It may just be related to kind of workplace disgruntlement, or maybe just some issues that need to be addressed. And so we bring in our HR department and other things really to kind of get ahead of those kind of issues. So we see insider threat is not just about focusing on loss of data. It's about improving employee health and it's improving that overall environment of the data that we work in.
Sure.
Keith, I appreciate how you just segued, because I think when we hear insider threat, we think someone is going to work intentionally to compromise or sabotage. And as mentioned earlier, the statistics DoD has shared, various studies commercially, most incidents involve human error, whether it's ignorance, negligence, or poor judgment. So when insider threat, when we realize that it is also including those who may be, oops, I made a mistake, that's where I think some of the strength of data analytics may lend to. And one quick thing, when you're driving down the road and you see your speed displayed on the side of the road, what do? You probably tap your brakes.
Look for a camera.
Exactly. National Highway Traffic Safety Agency says 80% likely that you think you're going to get a ticket and you slow down. So I'm really curious and excited, and I don't know the answer to this. How can predictive analytics, how can we tie all this analysis of this information to give us these nudges? And during the break, you mentioned if an email comes from an external source, the subject says external. That's one little nudge that kind of puts us on notice. I think DLP can be another one that helps, hey, is this really something that you wanted to send in the clear without encryption? And I'm really fascinated at what data analytics can do to help nudge us, because that's what's missing. 1 hour of training a year is simply not sufficient. So what are we doing to nudge people while they're behind the keyboard so they're not engaging in risky behavior?
All right, Mitchell, I wanted to ask you a kind of a final question here before we wind up, and we can hopefully have time to comment on it. But email has reemerged as a major threat vector for a variety of reasons, mainly because of how much more sophisticated the phishing attacks have become, modeled after individuals and not after groups and so on, and aimed at individuals and not at groups. What's DoD doing on that front?
Well, I think that Servio mentioned a couple of things that we are doing. So ultimately, we are trying to disable the links and things like that could show up in an email. So that will basically deal with the knee-jerk reaction of users to want to click on things. Ultimately, also the interpreting of emails that are coming in and giving visual cues that is also important. Fundamentally, the only sure defense is solely relying on a digital signature that you actually that we can assess the trust of through machine machine
Right,
purposes.
check it at the perimeter,
Right.
and not at the
Ultimately,
inbox.
to try and thwart a sophisticated effort to a social engineering attack is to try and take on the adversary in his space, as opposed to forcing him to fight in our space.
Well, I wish we had another hour, because there's lots of things we could pull on and discuss, but we are out of time. So let me thank today's guests. They were Mitchell Komaroff, the Principal Advisor for Cybersecurity Strategy, Planning and Oversight at the DoD CIO Office. Keith Johnson is the Chief Technology Officer and Chief Engineer for the Defense and Intelligence Group at Leidos. And Servio Medina, Chief of the Cybersecurity Policy Branch at the Defense Health Agency. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin, Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. For more on this discussion, be sure to visit federalnewsradio.com. Use the search term Leidos.
On behalf of Leidos, thank you for joining us. A link to the archived session will be sent to you shortly. If you requested a training certificate, you will also receive an email with download instructions after the webinar. This concludes our discussion. Thank you.